Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome. This is the Blue House, as you have very well guessed, the new office of the Honor Frost Foundation. We would like to welcome our colleagues, former students. The Quorum Foundation as well is with us here today. We're going to be speaking informally with two experts that work in maritime archaeology and archaeology broadly speaking in Lebanon. Dr. Nadine Panayot is the curator of the American University of Beirut's Archaeological Museum, and she is an associate professor of practice at the Department of History and Archaeology. Before AUB, she was the director of the University of Balaman's Archaeology and Museology Research Department, and the founder and chairperson of the Master's Program in Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management. She also co-founded and curated the Ethnographic Museum at Balamand. And she's been involved in and directed archaeological excavations all over the Near East since 1992. And in 2017, she was appointed as the Hima director of Anfeh. And for all these obvious reasons, she's here to speak to us today about her experience at Anfeh and her archaeological work at Anfeh. Dr. Lucy Sam'an has been HFF's lead maritime archaeologist in Lebanon since 2019, although she's been doing many things since before 2019 with the HFF. She's participated in and directed international maritime and terrestrial archaeological surveys and excavations, as well as geophysical, geoarchaeological, capacity building and outreach projects in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arab world since 1996. She teaches with me at the MSCU program at AUB, which is a minor program in marine sciences and culture. And has lectured in maritime archaeology in Lebanon and abroad. She holds a PhD in Arab and Islamic studies with a focus on maritime archaeology from the University of Exeter. And from 2016 to 2018, she was awarded a 3-year HFF-funded postdoc at the University of Balamand, where she undertook underwater survey off the coast of Anfeh. So, for that obvious reason, she is also with us here today to speak a little bit about her experiences at Anfeh. The format of today is not meant to be a conference. It's not meant to have a PowerPoint presentation. We just want to have a conversation with two people who have dedicated a big part of their lives to a very important site in Lebanon and for the maritime landscape of Lebanon as a whole. So it's going to be kind of a conversation format, and there'll be time at the end as well for everyone to ask questions. And we're hoping that this will kind of serve as one of many events where we'll have experts from Lebanon coming to share their experiences in the HFF office, because as I look around, we have many people who I'm sure would have a lot to offer. So. Just to start, I'm going to start with Nadine, but just a very broad question. How did everything begin? How did the archaeological missions at Anfeh start?
Well, it was back in 2010. We were due to go for our usual trip to Syria on the Turkish border, where we were participating in excavations at the site of Sirus. And well, as you know, all hell broke loose and we couldn't make it on that year. Instead, I was approached by the Director General of Antiquities in Lebanon, who asked me to help, give a hand with a project that they were just trying to finish real quick. It was mostly a preventive excavation, or the way they salvage excavations, the way they call it. At a tiny chapel called Sayyidat al-Rih in Anfeh. Since Sayyidat al-Rih, Anfeh is not too far from Balamand. Back then, I was still with Balamand. I said, yes, sure, I'll give you, a hand, whatever it takes. So basically, that tiny chapel was supposed to be renovated because a guy who is originally from Anfeh, who lives in the States, wanted to come back in the summer and baptize his son in this tiny chapel. So he sent some funds to Lebanon, to the father of the parish, and asked him to renovate that chapel, which was half destroyed. I mean, nothing from it was there. It was covered with plastic. There were like, it was just here and there. I mean, the locals had just kept, you know, maybe wild animals to walk into it. That's it. Other than that, it was open, completely destroyed. And so they got the permit to renovate because he sent the funds. But what initially was a quick okay was withdrawn by the DGA because, as you know, in our law, anything that is registered in our national inventory, you cannot renovate it without conducting excavations prior to the renovation. So it turns out that that tiny chapel was on the national inventory as medieval remains or vestiges. So yeah, which is fine. And so we had to, so they called us. This is why they contacted us. And we said, okay. So we started doing an excavation inside the chapel. And then we came across these huge cisterns carved into the rock underneath the chapel. And then outside, so obviously they also started doing the renovation outside. So before we finished the excavation, they were already working on restoring the structure of the chapel. So we had to run outside, and then we had to excavate. Now, what you need to understand that that chapel is surrounded by a Greek Orthodox cemetery that was, if you started in the mid-end of the Ottoman period, but still being in use by the Orthodox community in Anfeh. So it was, so that chapel, had been sitting there completely abandoned, you had all these funerary vaults built around it and sometimes against its walls. So you had about 2 meters of height, at least, if not 3, of just funerary vaults around the chapel as well. So removing these funerary vaults, we came across a mosaic pavement just by the chapel, I mean, and another huge cistern carved in the rock. So putting one and one together, turned out it was a very rich site. So there was mostly a water network around, underneath and around the chapel. On top of it came the chapel. Turns out that the chapel dates back to the Byzantine period, and we're talking late 6th, early 7th century, and we are extremely precise with our dating. And this is the material that we found on the floor, the Byzantine floor, and on the mosaic floor, pavement outside. And cherry on the cake, in one of those channels, underneath one of the antique cements, turns out we found just a lot of these pottery sherds. When we dated them, they all turned out to date back to the early Bronze Age period. So that was a huge surprise.
All from the chapel.
All from that tiny chapel. So we were completely, I mean, we just wondered, okay, they are in a channel, but still they are homogeneous. This is, you know, a pack for archaeologists. It's a pack of homogeneous material. So there is no, so that was quite weird. Where did they come from? If they, I mean, during the Bronze Age period, they couldn't have come from too far away. So this is where the following 2 years, I set a much larger program of researching the territory of Anfeh to look for a Bronze Age or Phoenician settlement in or around the town. So this is to answer technically your question.
Amazing how it happens. All from this
my mistake.
Very tight excavation at the chapel.
Yeah.
So building off of that, there's obviously very continuous occupation at the site. Can you just, I know it's difficult, but a brief overview kind of the historical development of the site as a whole, as well as the peninsula after your work?
So conducting these surveys turned out to be, I mean, a huge asset. So first, I mean, we determined a territory, which actually, a geographical territory that starts from Shikka, or the Barghoun River, which separates Shikka from Anfeh in terms of the geographical limits. towards the west, it would be the foothills of Jabal al-Jawz, and towards the north, the limit was the cape or the promontory of Deir al-Natur, of Ras al-Natur, which is further north from Deir al-Natur. So this is quite an extensive, if you want, territory. And if I mean, I'm just gonna brief you, or it's the tip of the iceberg of all our surveys and excavations since 2012 or 10 to this day. So you have definitely several occupation layers or stratas that date back to prehistoric times. And we're talking Upper Paleolithic all the way to the Neolithic period. And this is crazy because we even were able to identify a abri sous roche shelter, yeah, that is also located south of Deir al-Natur. Around Deir al-Natur, all these salt pans, and around them, especially in the olive groves, you have tons and tons of material, lithic tools, as I said, that cover all these prehistoric periods. And as well, towards the south, we have also a Tell al-Arab, where as well we had a lot of prehistoric material. So this is in terms of prehistory. Then you have definitely, today we can certify that we have early Bronze Age material and an occupation layer. That is for sure. Then we have a gap. So we have the Middle Bronze Age period as well, but then Late Bronze Age and early quote-unquote Phoenician, we have kind of a gap for this period. And then after that, we don't have we have barely any Greco-Roman. And then again, we have a very heavy occupation layer or layers of late Byzantine period. And then obviously, again, during the medieval period, Fatimid we do have, but also medieval and crusaders. As you know, Anfeh is known for its crusaders castle, which is built in the water, with its feet in the water. And then again, after that, you have some kind of an abandonment under the Mamluk period, or after the Mamluk occupation, you have some kind of an abandonment, and then again, the Ottoman period. Now, I'm not saying that these are chronological gaps, but what I'm saying is that to this day, we don't have these occupation layers. Could be that we haven't excavated long enough yet, but it looks like it.
So to tie on that, do you have kind of any wish lists, any areas that to explore in the future that you would have that you'd like to explore to kind of address these gaps?
Definitely, I definitely want to go ahead with developing the early Bronze Age occupation layers because we have them now, we know where they are, and we definitely want to excavate them. This is on the promontory, besides the other sites, but I would like to focus on the promontory because a lot of people said there is no way you can find any material on the promontory. Why? Because the promontory, the cape, which we call also the citadel or the al-Al'a, Ras al-Al'a as they call it, is actually covered, littered with salt ponds. So we had to remove the salt ponds, and between the rock and the salt ponds, we found all these archaeological layers, which is almost unbelievable for any archaeologist. I mean, it's amazing. It's a very complicated site because everything is carved in the rock, but at the same time, wherever you have a little bit of layers, you have all this material, condensed material that you can actually study.
Okay, then let's transition to Lucy. So for the maritime side of things, so how did your involvement in in exploring the maritime landscape of Anfeh first begin?
Actually, it was thanks to Nadine who entrusted me with this task. I was back then in the UK undertaking my PhD in maritime archaeology and helping the foundation just at its early beginning, not really being involved officially and so on. And we learned that the foundation is offering the first round of grants for small studies. So I remember Nadine called and she was like, we have to do something for Anfeh and you're gonna do the underwater survey. And I'm like, me? Like, are you sure? She's like, yes. She's, I have to say, she's the best mentor I had. And thanks to her, really, and her trust, she wanted me to do it, and this is how she applied for the funding from the foundation, and we got it. We were very lucky in that sense, because also Nadine has, renowned, she's renowned in the field, she's a very serious academic, so her work speaks for her, as it were, and with other references and support we got locally, we applied, it was a good proposal. And we set up a team, I set up a team, and then back then I think the DGA also was supportive, but they wanted us to do the field work in October. And that was at a time where we thought, yeah, great, the water is amazing at that time of the year, but no. So it was a bit challenging because we didn't know the site before. Nothing was done really at the site except for some sporadic underwater surveys by a local diver called Zari Amadouni back in the 80s during the Civil War. So he did a survey around the promontory and located a few underwater material. We don't know what happened to this material because his house was bombed and so on, and so we had to do everything from scratch again. So adopt the methodology to the site, which is very challenging. Being on the site itself, I mean, it's the best waters you really can dive in. It's the cleanest water. The visibility is amazing.
No bias, by the way. It's true. It's true.
Yeah. Maybe I am a bit biased, but honestly, the divers among you know this. So we were very lucky as well in that sense, and I had very solid support from Nadine, from the grant that she got for this, and from the team, who are my friends and colleagues, and they came to volunteer, really. Like, no one was paid. They all were working on a volunteering basis. They even paid for their own tickets. With a, reduced amount of money, let's say, with a small grant, we couldn't pay for everybody's flights. So yeah, it was a success. At least we could assess the area around the promontory in the northern bay and in the southern bay as well, just the bays adjacent to the Ras Al Ala, which extends the site of Anfeh westwards. And from the material we had, it was obvious that it was a very rich area underwater as well as on land from Nadine's studies. So we added to the potential, to the high, but we contributed our part to the to the archaeological potential that Nadine was, battling to show and try to fight for the conservation of the site. So we were very happy to be able to help her with this.
I think the results probably showed that quite a bit.
Yeah.
So this is obviously, it turned into a project with a pretty significant scale, especially when you compare it to any previous underwater work that had been done in Lebanon. So in many ways, you probably were kind of, I don't want to say figuring out the methodology, because obviously you had a methodology prepared.
Yeah, but we did.
Can you speak on this? Yeah. How did you develop a methodology that works specific? Because Anfeh is also a very unique site as well in Lebanon. So can you speak a little bit about it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we really were, we had the humility to know that, okay, our plan A didn't work, so what do we do now? We have to have a plan B, C, etc. So we used several methodologies that would be basically that when we first assess the environment, this is where we were flexible enough to adapt the methodology depending on the topography or the areas of the site where we were working. So what you see underwater basically is next to the promontory. You've got the promontory drops underwater in a series of reefs, okay? And then these reefs give way to large sandy stretches. So we think that under the sand, there must have been buried archaeology. So to investigate this is one technique, which I will tell you about. And for the rocky interface, so this rocky sea bottom traps archaeological material. So visually, as a diver, you could see it and you could record it better. Since we were really wanted to assess both the underwater topography to understand the site better, just like you do on land. So we use basically the same methodologies that you would use on land. So we would target both the archaeology and the natural features, so the underwater topography, which we call the bathymetry. And for this, we used marine geophysical equipment. So that is the use of equipment that gives an idea or an image of the seabed or what there is on the seabed, and if any archaeological material is buried under the seabed, then this will appear on your sonars as well. Okay, so this is one set of methodological inquiry that we did. And then the other one would be diver-based visual surveying. So in order to explore in more details what you can see trapped within the reefs and within the rocky sea bottom. We also used a lot of geomorphological indication in order for us to understand how the site was formed, why we are finding material here and not over there, what explains the presence of anchors at this side of the promontory, not on the other. So we used all these methodologies to, just like you would on land, to understand better the site. And then when we first started in 2013, we had said, okay, we're going to use, they teach us at university, corridor searches. Well, good luck setting lines, straight lines, when the GPS goes like that crazy at sea. So we were like, okay, let's drop this methodology. What can we do? Let's do the circular search method. Basically, it helps us to set a center point underwater, and you're going to see the methodology if you visit the exhibition after our talk. So we set basically a center point, and the divers start navigating around this point using their eyes to locate any archaeology that might be present on the seabed. And we take notes and we take pictures, dimensions, and so on. Did I answer
You did. It sounds like I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, kind of figuring things out and going through plan A, then plan B, then plan C, and then saying, okay, plan D, we'll go with plan D.
And plan D was just snorkeling as well, because there are the areas that were just by the promontory were very shallow, so there was no need really to use any scuba diving
so snorkeling
apparatus. So we just went snorkeling in a swim line, keeping current constant check on our fellow diver, on our fellow swimmer, keep communication clear, because it's very hard also to communicate underwater. We cannot talk like.
It's a bit difficult, yes.
Yeah, you guys, on land archaeologists, have it easy. I can say that.
Yeah. I'm going to take it back to Nadine and and switch a little bit more towards community and the community development. So you mentioned how the project actually started, which is someone sending a donation and kickstarting everything. So how did, as the years progressed, how did the community react? How did you see everyone responding to these new archaeologists coming in and digging at the site and discovering all these new things? What was your experience with this?
You have to know one thing. Day one, when we were called by the DGA, so we had an appointment to meet with the parish, with the father in charge of the parish there, and the representative of the DGA. We had a meeting at Saïd Tarih. That was day one, 2010. We're waiting there. We walk in, I get there, and nobody's talking to anyone. They're not talking to each other. What's wrong? Well, each one of them briefed me on the side to tell me that they actually stopped talking to each other because of a previous project in Deir al-Natur and
You became the bridge.
so they just basically burned their bridges. And the father was extremely tensed because, okay, he received the fund, he's renovating the chapel, and he already got the permit. I don't know why, how, but this is another issue. We don't get there. But now they're telling him, well, you can't do the renovation. You have to wait for the archaeologist. And the DGA is going to do the excavation, and he has these issues with the DGA, so he doesn't want to talk to the DGA. So when he sees us coming, walking in, he says, okay, who are you? I said, we're from the University of Balamand. We're here because we're answering the call of the DGA. We're going to be leading the discussions on behalf of the DGA, with the DGA, and with you guys. And so we started one thing after the other. We started, really, we built a friendship with these people. This is the minimum we can say. So much that a year later, during the Ramadan, we couldn't find any workers to, work with us, help us on the site. So the people from the parish ended up working themselves in person, including the father, his son, his family. Everybody was helping. Everybody was pitching in. This is one thing. The other thing that happened is, as we were excavating that first year and the following year, I noticed that every time somebody walked in from the village, they would step in and say, what are you doing here? We would say, we're, excavating and stuff. And every time they would say, when we were kids, we used to run away from school and come into this chapel. We used to take seawater and throw it on the walls, and then we would see the Virgin Mary would appear to us. First guy tells you this, that's cute. Second guy, that's, okay, what a coincidence. Third, and then I said, okay, hold on, guys. So I briefed my team. I said, look, every time a guy walks in from the village, 1, you never kick them out. 2, you welcome them. And 3, you take notes. Whatever they tell you, you take notes. I didn't know what I was going to do with these notes, but I thought it's a way of recording oral history, oral stories, and we'll see what we'll do with them. And eventually, believe it or not, when you put one and one together, it turns out that indeed, because when I'm describing a partly destroyed chapel, when you walk in, all the walls were black, were covered with moist, with, we used to think that maybe, okay, the water is next, right by the chapel, but at the same time, people walk in and they just light these candles all day long, all night. It's like, and you don't know where this dark black walls come from. But I was convinced by adding one and one and putting one and one together, I thought that all of this black layer is actually salty concretions. And that all it takes is a mechanical cleaning of the facade to find any wall paintings. That is. And indeed, so first time when I talked to the not the Honor Frost, you were not in the picture yet, but when I spoke to the Association de Restauration des Fresques Médiévales au Liban, they said, but there's nothing in Anfeh. And no, we've been there, there's nothing there, and the chapel, it's completely destroyed. I said, okay. One day, believe it or not, I only tell stories. That's how I like to talk about archaeology. So one day, I swear to God, I walk into my office and I have a missed call in my office. I never call back because I never have time. On that day, I don't know why, I was in a good mood. I pick up the phone and I call back. It was a number in Beirut. And this very old person is on the other line, and he says, well, are you so-and-so? I said, yes. How can I help you? He said, well, I've been trying to reach Nadine. I said, this is she, and I would like to fund your works in Anfeh. I said, yeah, well, how come? He says, well, I'm very sorry. I am from Anfeh, but I apologize, but I have to ask you to come to my house because I have stopped being able to move and to come to Anfeh, although I am from Anfeh originally. I said, of course, I mean, it would be an honor anyway. He told me his name, and he said, I have one condition. I want this to remain anonymous. That's why I'm not repeating his name. So I said, sure. So on my next day, I visit him in his house in Beirut, and he says, well, I'm so-and-so. He turns out to be a huge lawyer. And he tells me, well, I would like to fund anything that you do in chapels in Anfeh. Chapels, archaeological. I said, fine. Well, we have this project. We would like to renovate these wall paintings, but we have no funding for that. So Balamand University was funding my excavations and research project, etc. But I can't ask them to fund the renovation of the wall paintings. That's another ball game. So he said, sure, I'll do that. And, just tell me how much you need and I'm writing you a check. I said, no way. He said, why not? He said, look, I mean, I don't know you. You don't know me. Well, I'm sorry to say that, but he says, well, I've heard enough. I said, that's very kind. I'm flattered, but you see that reputation? I'd like to keep it. So I'm working with the university. You go, first I offered to introduce him to the parish people. He said no. I offered to introduce him to the municipality. He said no. I said, well, there's one last, I work for a university. You either deal with them or you don't deal with me at all. There's no way I'm accepting a check. So this is how it happened. We went through, the university, the controller's office, so on and so forth. And we did the restoration, the mechanical conservation of these wall paintings. It turns out that the entire walls or the vault was covered with wall paintings over 2 layers, not one, but 2 layers. And we did not do a restoration, but we did a consolidation and a conservation, mechanical cleaning, and a conservation of the whole thing with the University of Warsaw, who came for 3 years in a row, including, and then this is when actually the Foundation for the Renovation of Medieval Frescoes of Lebanon stepped in. No, they stepped in, they joined. And so we finished that project together for over a period of 3 years.
Interesting.
So this is to tell you that something that started off on the wrong foot ended up becoming a really extremely fruitful collaboration, and I would even say necessary collaboration, because I discovered that working on an archaeological site without including the local community doesn't mean anything.
And you've worked with salt producers as well.
This is another also layer of that project. So this project started growing organically. One thing led to another. So we started with archaeology, then we discovered that Anfeh is rich not just because of its historical and archaeological, remains, but also because of its natural potential and its natural richness. So this is when we added, although we're not specialists at all, but we started looking and documenting as well all the natural environment. And to me, it was an amazing discovery. Because we had the luxury to be there during several seasons, unlike traditional excavations where you go for 1 month per year. So we got to visit the site throughout the year with the underwater surveys, and so every time we were there, we would discover new plants, new fauna and flora every time. Yeah. So we were really documenting all year round the fauna and the flora, and we're actually today publishing this whole thing, including the archaeology. So for me, it becomes one more layer.
Holistic, yeah. And this is the next thing actually that I wanted to touch on, which is that now Anfeh enjoys a lot of protection, not just for the archaeology, but for its ecosystem as a whole. So how did this develop now in terms of applying for various levels or any titles now that Anfeh has? Can you speak a little bit about that in terms of the ecosystem as a whole, archaeology and...
Yeah. So as
and,
yeah.
and also, sorry, the cultural practices in terms of were studied as well by Nadine and her colleague. In terms of salt production, traditional salt production, and also a colleague of ours, Dr. Julian Janssen van Ransburg, did just one season, but it was very telling as well on fishing practices. So, and that's again another whole set of cultural practices that we're trying to document at the
Preserve.
sites. Yeah.
To preserve at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So when we say it grew organically, it means that we added one layer on top of another. So we started with archaeology, we added the environment, then we added the ethnography, we added the social economic settings of the site, of the town. And we looked at their fishing practices, their salt production, because these were the sources of income for the local population. If you're dealing with them, you cannot not deal with whatever is, allowing them to survive. And then we discovered that there was a huge project that was actually, that has been talked about since the mid-1990s, and that was threatening the biggest plot of land around Deir al-Natur, which is around 850,000 square meters of land. So we're talking almost 1 million square meters, and these are waqf land, and they have been rented out to a private sector, and this entire landscape, cultural landscape, was going to be destroyed and replaced with yet another resort, hotels, malls, and I went crazy. And so since 2010, I've been battling against these, entrepreneurs to explain to them the importance and the relevance of that site that was completely neglected when we got there in 2010, completely neglected. And that was really being eaten away, one piece at a time, by, we already had, during the war, we had these 2 huge resorts built in the town. But this was during the war, and this is how the entire Lebanese coast was covered, littered with these resorts. We call them illegal, they call them legal. That's not the point. We all know that they got their legal permits, quote unquote, but then this was under or during the war. So how much pressure or how much, all kinds of...
I think we all understand.
You all understand. So we're not...
Intentions, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
So we're not discussing the legal issue. We're looking, what can we do to preserve whatever is left? And whatever is left was extremely impressive. So we assessed it, we looked at it, and we decided that it's time for us to at least try to protect this. I remind you that I come from, the reason why I was excavating in Syria is because I was really disappointed in whatever was happening in Beirut. We were part of the first excavation that took place in downtown Beirut in 1993. And after excavating 3 sites, and this is when I said enough, it's over. Beirut is gone, there's nothing we can protect there, so let's go outside this country altogether.
This is where we met, in Beirut.
So
I was her trainee. And then she took me with her to Syria as well.
I took her everywhere.
Yeah.
So that's another issue. So that's the point. It's because I was really extremely upset with whatever happened in Beirut that I decided to put everything I can to protect that area. And then I discovered that, yes, there are other ways for protection. So in a nutshell, what has been done to protect this in technical and scientific terms? In 1998, 1999, it was added, not by me, but by other, not scientists, civil, the civic society back then, 1998. The Ras Al Al'a was added on the World Monument Watch list. Then in 2017, I added it again. 2017, I introduced the director of the SPNL, Society for the Protection of Nature in Lebanon, to the president of the Municipality Council in Anfeh, and they invited us to one of their meetings, and unanimously, the council voted to turn Anfeh into a Hima. Hima means protected area. It is not a natural reserve. And I'm not going to lecture now about the concept of Hima, but it turns out it was an extremely effective tool because it's one way of, bypassing all the, how should I call
legal
it?
nightmare?
No, administrative, if you want, legal nightmares. So this allowed us and then I was elected the director, Hima director, which turned me into a stakeholder. Although I'm not from the north. I'm not from Anfeh. I'm not from the north. I'm from Beiruti, and extremely hurt Beiruti. So I became a stakeholder in the quote unquote management of the town, and this allowed us to build on this experience. So in 2019, I was able to use all this research to write a text that was used by the DGA to add Anfeh on the UNESCO indicative list, which was a huge, step forward. And then in 2019, we also managed to sell 7 tons of Anfeh to a cosmetic company. Salt, sorry, of what? Of Anfeh?
What?
Anfeh salt. Literally speaking, it is. Anfeh salt, a piece of Anfeh salt, 7 tons to a cosmetic company based in the UK. They were supposed to come in October 2019. They had their tickets reservation, hotel reservation, everything got canceled with the Saura. And then 2020, it was added on in 2022, it was added on a decree that made it through the government and is now waiting approval by the parliament. It's in the drawers of the parliament.
To be a natural
to become
reserve.
one of the PMA protected maritime areas. So it will become a natural reserve. This is in 2022. And then 2 weeks ago, we received at the closing ceremony of the Med Artsal, which is a European network of the salt producers around the Mediterranean that was conducted by Fairtrade Lebanon. In the closing ceremony, that was organized in Anfeh. I was asked to represent Anfeh, and on that day came the Minister of Tourism and the Minister of the Environment, and they declared Anfeh officially a protected area and part of the ecotourism trail for Lebanon and Europe. So this is a nice achievement. So it's one baby step at a time.
Well, there were some bigger than baby steps, but yes, steps, I guess, step at a time, definitely. Okay, I'm going to take it back to Lucy because we're hearing a lot about salt. And this is very maritime in nature for obvious reasons. And we're talking a little bit about the community and how everything fits together. So can you speak a little bit about salt production in Anfeh as something that is historical, archaeological, but also potentially economic in nature in the modern
I must say though that I'm no expert on the matter, and our colleague Nadine's colleague Rita Kalinjian, she's now the curator, right, of the Ethnography Museum. She has done her MA on the ethnographic campaigns of the salt production.
No.
No, not at all.
No, just
Not even
no.
close.
She's on board. She was part of the team.
Okay.
She was part of the team, and she is the one who conducted the ethnographic campaigns. Yes, in Anfeh.
Yeah. So, but Nadine would be able to answer the question. So, correct me if I'm wrong.
Go ahead.
Because I was taught well, so I'm gonna just repeat.
Go ahead.
Basically, the salt production in Anfeh, we've got several historical pictures in black and white, very blurry, but that show clearly that the whole area has been exploited through the production of salt, and it was covered by salt marshes, as several other sites in Lebanon, like Batroun as well. However, what is unfortunate in the case of Anfeh is that in the 90s, the Egyptian salt started being imported to Lebanon, and it was subsidized by the government, which meant that it was cheaper to buy foreign salt, Egyptian salt for that matter, than buying the locally produced salt.
This is GAFTA,
So this is
the Greater Arab Free Trade Agreement
Yeah.
at that time.
exactly.
Yeah.
So part of it was more or less targeting, intentional or not intentional, we don't know, but we think that most probably it might have been intentional, because later on, the stakeholders in the project at Deir el-Natur, where the salt marshes are, part of them have links to the people that banned, like that. Yeah. Exactly, what a coincidence. So basically the salt used to be called the gold, the white gold of Anfeh, right? And there are several circular pits that you find on the promontory cut in the rock. Now popular tradition has it that, they date from the Phoenician period, because, it's more of a national pride, right? The identification with Phoenician heritage. So however, we cannot date these. Dating a rocky interface is very different, next to impossible, unless you want to date it through a stratigraphy via cosmonucleide technique, which is quite complicated. It's not accurate at all. So anyhow, dating these rock cut features is very challenging. And we wouldn't know really if they were, in fact, dated back to the Phoenician period. But if we want to understand this in a holistic manner, if people still modify the landscape to fit their needs, if people still go out fishing, if people still, at least in the previous century, they produce salt, they go and fish, and they keep the same traditional fishing methods. We call this a living tradition, because they do use the inherent knowledge that they had from their predecessor, but surely they adapted to a new technology that we have. So the felucas, these fishing boats, for example, used to be rowed. Now we've got generators, but does it mean that the fishing practice is still traditional? Yes, you can, because it's a living tradition that adapts to the technology of the time, but still using the same place names of fishing areas in Anfeh. They use the same navigational references. They repeat sea chants, sea shanties, as we call them, when they haul the felucas on land for repair and so on. They still go to Sayyidat al-Rih to ask for blessings for the protection against winds and waves and unforeseen natural events and so on. So
Even in the name. Even in the name, تحت الريح.
Exactly, تحت الريح, under the wind. So, and Our Lady of the Wind means that the lady, the Virgin Mary that calms the winds, that calms the waves. So fishermen can have, or fisher persons can have a safe voyage. So I mean, I personally, I don't see why there wouldn't be a more ancient tradition of salt making and salt extraction, because, well, people have to eat, right? And it's readily available, and the sea is still clean and was still cleaner back then. So,
and it hopefully will get cleaner as well over the next
Yes.
few years, given all this work that you're doing.
surely with it has, the HEMA has made a difference as well. Yes. Yeah.
That's excellent. Okay, I'm going to, because we are over the time and I want to give some time for everyone to ask questions if they'd like, but just a brief for both of you, whatever you see. Where do you see Anfeh in I don't want to say a specific amount of years, but you know, in 10 years, given all the work that you've done, what would you like to see at the site in terms of the economic opportunities as well as all these social aspects that you've explored here today? If we start with Nadine, maybe.
Well, I'm hoping. I never forget that we're in Lebanon. And as Sheikh Walid Jamblad says, everything can be scratched by the shahtit alam, as he very well says. So I'm hoping that all these efforts will actually we will build on something that has been achieved on the long term, because well, I was told 2 weeks ago during that ceremony that I was boasting that when we came to Anfeh, there was not one guest house, and now we have 9. And then one of the young people come in and he says, "Doctor, please correct, we are 22 guest houses now in Anfeh." This is quite an achievement. By the same token, this is also thanks to the financial crisis. I mean, one, I'm not saying that my efforts paid off and that's I stopped these stakeholders, investors. I don't think so. I think the financial crisis stopped them. We're just building on that, and the fact that that today, as you have observed all around Lebanon, you have tons and tons of guest houses around Lebanon, in the mountains and everywhere. Every housewife is opening her kitchen and offering, you know. So these are new practices because people need to survive. So salt extraction has really benefited from that. So we're building now, and we're also using this Med Artsal European project that helped refurbish some of these salt pans using, as we mentioned, new technologies and better products to protect the salt pans. And so now we have even higher quality of salt being produced in Anfeh. So I'm hoping to keep building on that know-how, on that knowledge. I used to have an ex-student who graduated as a electrical engineer and who is now fully working in the salt production like his father and his grandfather. So this is to tell you that for him, that's one way of surviving instead of looking for a job as an electrical engineer. So this is where I see Anfeh. I see it as a leading example of sustainable, long-term ecotourism initiatives and small development projects, sustainable development projects. So this is where I'm hoping.
Excellent. And Lucy, as well, maybe in the maritime angle?
Yeah, from a maritime angle, I would say that surely building on the community outreach activities, and having established these bridges with the local population of Anfeh, that they would become the protectors of their own heritage, as it were. Yes, and also we know very well that it's very easy because you don't see underwater cultural heritage, it's very easy to dismiss it or to forget that it is there. but by speaking frequently, explaining to the locals and the non-locals, the divers, to the diving community in general, that this has merit in preserving in situ, because something I always tell them is that when you lift an anchor and you sell it in the black market, you get a one-off payment, whereas if you would bring in other snorkelers or divers with whom will be interested in exploring something new, then you would have, you know, more groups and therefore charge on a longer term.
Continuity.
Exactly. And also, when you give them this incentive, then they will realize this is, you know, this is quite important and needs to be preserved. And some of them are very proud people as well, so they would add this to their, you know, skill set, let's say, or to their pride that they're protecting their local heritage.
That's something
from
to
being
use.
sold. You know, that's something also to capitalize on. But I would say keep the dialogue going, and not let them be scared and afraid to
Speak to archaeologists.
Yes.
And say, we do have these things.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And I think that, you know, we should say also, when we speak about the maritime or the underwater activities we undertook at Anfeh, is that the Honor Frost Foundation was a large supporter of this, and many, I mean, they made my postdoc under the supervision of Nadine at Balamand possible. You know, for this we're both very grateful to the foundation. And this is how we also proved to the foundation that, you know, serious archaeology can exist in Lebanon, being led by locals. I get a lot of my students involved in the underwater archaeology at Anfeh. So this, again, it's a wonderful opportunity to get students involved, to work on a site that has a lot still to offer. Yeah.
I think that's a good place for us to stop. I think we could talk for hours about
Yes.
every aspect of Anfeh, but hopefully everyone's gotten an idea of not just from reports or from publications, but from the excavators and surveyors themselves, of just their experience from start to finish. And I hope that this is the start in the HFF, the new HFF office, of many others as well sharing their experiences, and we can learn from each other and get a better understanding of what actually is taking place, not just along the coast in Lebanon, but maybe pushing a little bit inland as well, but we'll see. So thank you to our speakers today, and we can open the floor to questions. Does anyone have a question for either speaker? Yeah?
Yes, so I have first a technical question. Yes, so a technical question about this interesting from the bar. So about the geophysics, was it lifted? Is it sinking? What's happening there? So is it like stable? I think it is.
No, the site is very unstable because lots of fractures, local fractures go through the site, right? So it's in a high seismic area, quite active. To the south, basically, if you imagine the promontory going west, this is north, this is south, the promontory is tilting a bit northwards. So when you dive northwards, you can see that the reefs drop really dramatically, and the deeper parts of the sea bottom are reached not very far away from the coastline, the apparent coastline. But then to the southern part, you've got these sort of very large, at the same level platforms that stretch way wider, on a wider area than to the north. We also realized that there are, through the study of archaeology and more specifically the slipways that are present on the site, that there has been the uplift that was reported by Morange and his colleagues in 2006 the uplift that was caused by the 6th century AD of 551 of between 80 centimeters and 1 meter. So you can see clearly the 80 centimeters uplift in Anfeh.
So generally it's related to the general uplifting of the north, but like that is also related to some minor faults as well.
Yes, because also on the side you've got the first moat that was slightly distorted. Yeah, the second moat was distorted, basically in the wall separating the first moat and the second moat. But the first moat, just by the entrance to the fortress, it has also a large fracture that showed Miocene shells in it. So this surely must have happened after the original uplift. But it's also now, according to our Lebanese geologist, that this is an event that will recur every 1,500 years. The time is in May.
Another question, Nadim, you mentioned a river between the north and what's the name?
Barahoun River.
Barahoun. Barahoun. Yeah, it's like interesting because
To the south.
yeah, it's
And
like
north you've got Haile.
yeah, because there's another. This is a Barahoun, but there's a Barahoun in Saida.
But
it's like
we know
the same.
it's not the same one.
Yeah, it's the same route. You know, like Saida, like أولها تمضي وآخرها Barahoun.
About Lucy was saying that the salt production, I mean, we have to say that Anfeh is the last remaining, I mean, we had several sites in Lebanon from south to north where you used to extract salt, except that Anfeh is the last one surviving.
It was the most important. It was the most important source.
Yes, it was
Why?
the white
Is the
gold.
water better?
Because, yes, two reasons. The wind keeps changing every 3 days, so this allows you to produce a particular fleur de sel only there. And the other reason is the cleanliness of the water. As we mentioned, the CNMS has been conducting, as you know, every year they publish their results on the cleanliness of water in Lebanon. So I've been monitoring it since 2010, and every year Ras Anfeh and Ras Al Naoura are the cleanliest waters on the entire Lebanese coast. But this is due to the fact that this huge plot of land that I mentioned and the mountain, the Jabal al-Juz on top of it, they don't have any construction on them. I mean, it's not something it's a fact. And that's why, for me, it became paramount to protect that last remaining part of the coastal landscape of Lebanon. I mean, this is something important to preserve when you consider how much the rest has been completely distorted and demolished and eaten
Overbuilt.
But did you find any underwater springs?
Springs, yes, we do. We have.
Towards Shikha.
لا قدام Las Salinas there is a major spring.
Yeah.
Spring, yes.
If you found many anchors, it means that there will be a lot of activities in that area.
Yes, 58 anchors.
It was the harbor, the point of anchorage.
Yeah.
What was the internet, if you say? What was behind it?
We think that there were several harbor places that could have been used for boats to reach the coast, unload merchandise, and so on, and offload it, etc. One of the main bays that is the most protected is the Nhaire Bay, which is now occupied by the two modern resorts. Unfortunately there, we couldn't do anything because it's highly disturbed, and earth from elsewhere was brought in and dumped underwater in order to build these jetties, the breakwaters that we see and they encroached on the sea quite a lot. So anything that might have remained from antiquity is now gone. That's one thing. The other thing, closer to the promontory, there is a very large bay that is very much protected from the dominant southwesterly winds by the promontory that extends east-west. So in this area, there has been a substantial amount of anchors and pottery material. So surely there must have been important economic activities there. You've got in the hinterland the olive groves and the vines and so on. So this production was surely coming out by sea. Now to the south, although this area is very much open to the southwesterly winds, and as Nadine said, the winds shift quite often, then all the anchorages to the south could have been used when the northerly winds would blow. This is one thing. And another interesting fact, by using this multidisciplinary approach that we did in Anfeh, through the use of geomorphology technique or approaches, we found out that maybe the reason why there are so many anchors on the southern side, just by the wall of the reef underwater, is that because of the tsunami or the earthquake of 551, there has been the northern facade of Ras al-Sha'a, which is in Hiri, Shikka, has had landslides, so large chunks of the mountain facade fell into the water, creating tsunami-like waves that would have brought all the anchors dotted on the southern bays, because the south coast is very nice and easy, low-lying, very accessible from the sea. So in contrast with the northern part, which is high and rocky and cliffy and so on, so more difficult of access. So in this south side, all the anchors were brought by this wave, the huge, massive, momentum that was created by the sliding of the mountain, and they bumped into the reef wall, and they settled by the.
But it means that you had a lot of activity in that area.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there any hope that you have a historical proof of a city there, or an agglomeration?
We have the mention in Tel Al Amarna letters.
Yeah.
We have 6 letters actually that mention Anfeh under the Ampa, then Ampi.
This is
and then
very important to highlight, because
yes, we usually we start our lecture with
because
here
because
we have
this
no,
is a
no PowerPoint, nothing to go by. We were supposed to tell stories and to have a conversation, and we were supposed to answer Nassim's questions only. So definitely
to give to the history of that site some myth or.
just to go back on the toponymy. For me, it's very important and highly indicative. And plus the oral history, as we mentioned, all the people pride themselves and say, yes, Anfeh is a Phoenician town, Anfeh is a Phoenician, everything you see is Phoenician. And I'm like, okay, this is wishful thinking, but still. So when we conducted the surveys and the excavation and so on and so forth, turns out that it's early Bronze Age material. And we have prehistoric material. And we found 2 funerary jars when we sent the bones to the Oxford lab. They dated to the Chalcolithic period. So this is definitely an occupation there. Now, we do have very few fragments of pottery sherds and very few evidence of an occupation layer during the Phoenico-Persian period. But this doesn't mean, as I said, that we have a gap now, because it is mentioned in the Esarhaddon registry when he mentions Ampa and then Ampi. So it's Ampa in 1300 BC in the Amarna letters, and then it's Ampi in the Esarhaddon inventory, and then again, we might identify it as Trieris, mentioned in the Greek
Greco-Roman,
literature.
yeah.
And then again, if it is Trieris, then it would be Terus under the Roman,
Yeah.
under the Latin rule. And then again, we find it as Anfeh, and then Nefin under the Crusaders, and again Anfeh in contemporary. And all of these words indicate Nefas or Anf. Anf, which is the shape of this promontory. So it is, and Baroon can correct us if we're wrong. Anf or Nefas in Semitic language would highly indicate the nose itself, which is the shape of the topography and of the promontory. And this is why it's highly indicative of definitely there was a high activity. And 58 anchors, we're not, these are not just sandwiches.
No joke.
58 anchors ranging from the early Bronze Age all the way to, what is the latest period you found?
Probably modern, because these were
These stone
reused.
anchors are dated of what period, actually? There must have been a reason to drop your anchor. A boat without an anchor is useless. So if they lost their anchor there,
No one drops.
if they lost their anchors there, they lost their ship too.
Totally. And that's why we did
Army
the...
of 5551.
Yes.
There are shapes that are similar to the ones in the Bronze Age, shape and size and weight. But then again, these are found on the surface. So they're not associated with any pottery material for us to be, sure 100%, but they could be.
You would write a story of Anfeh chronologically from all what has been written on it. So we have no continuation of it. It is suddenly Phoenician, suddenly Roman, suddenly Byzantium, thanks to this church. There must be a chronology in its history.
Yeah, I mean, the promontory is
working on it,
400
right?
meters long.
We hope that Nadine will write the story of Anfeh.
It's in the press.
Bravo.
It's in the press. We have a first monography on Anfeh, and the second one coming soon as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.